Hi everyone. Our DSSG project was titled Exploring New Understandings of the Cost of Living at a Basic Needs Level Using the Self-Sufficiency Standard database. So the fellows were Chang, myself, Priyana, Aziza, and Hector. And our project leads were Annie Kuklik and Lisa Manzer from the Center for Women's Welfare in the School of Social Work here at the University of Washington. And our data scientist was Brenna Hazelton from the East Science Institute, also here at the University of Washington. So I'm first going to start off by talking about the US official poverty measure. And so the official poverty measure sets eligibility for critical benefits such as food assistance, childcare subsidies, or housing vouchers. Many families, however, cannot afford their basic needs and are not considered in need by the US official poverty measure. And so how it's measured hasn't been changed since it was created in the 1960s, and it doesn't vary by place. So the poverty line is the same for Mississippi as it is for the state of Washington. So the self-sufficiency standard is a budget-based living wage measure that determines the amount of income required to meet basic needs at a minimally adequate level. And it was created by Dr. Diana Pierce at the Center for Women's Welfare to provide an alternative to the official poverty measure. And so it includes the costs for the basic costs for a budget, but it does not include luxuries such as eating out, and it only includes what you need to get by without the use of subsidies. The standard is calculated for 42 states here in the United States, and the Center for Women's Welfare strives to make the standard as consistent and accurate as possible. So the data used to impute the standard is calculated and collected using standardized or equivalent methodology nationwide. It's obtained from scholarly or credible sources such as the US Census Bureau. It's updated regularly, and it's geographically and age specific as appropriate. So who utilize and interact with the self-sufficiency standard data? So community organizations, academic researchers, policy institutes, legal advocates, training providers, community action agencies, and state and local officials are just a few of the people who utilize the data. And they can use it as a policy analysis, a counseling tool, an evaluation tool, a benchmark for wage setting, targeted allocation of resources to further research, and also as a community indicator. So for this project, some of the community partners that we spoke to include the Workforce Development Council of Seattle-King County, and they utilize the standard to provide financial counseling to their customers. We also had conversations with the Colorado Center on Law and Policy, and they use the standard to advocate for better wages and to support employment. And in addition to our partners, we heard more from Dr. Pierce, the founder of the standard, who utilizes the tool to validate costs for testimony as an expert witness in Congress. And lastly, we spoke with our project leads, Annie and Lisa, who are researchers here at the Center for Women's Welfare, and which ultimately manages the standard and its data. And they were the primary stakeholders for this project. And so while we weren't able to speak with every partner, the Center for Women's Welfare utilizes has a breadth of partners who utilize the standard to further their work in their respective states across the country. While the self-sufficiency standard data is open and publicly available and also readily used by its partners, the workflow to transform the data is inefficient and hard to reproduce, and this makes it difficult to conduct deeper, more novel analyses. So the current challenge with the data is that it's spread across state and year in separate files and locations on the self-sufficiency standard website. And while the files are extremely standardized, how the data is formatted makes it difficult for automated analysis. And this is, for example, because there could be duplicates or spelling errors. And then when conducting analyses, because they're done manually, it requires manual validation to check that everything was transferred correctly, especially when copying and pasting from tables. And because of this, it's difficult to track the workflow and the specific steps that are taken. And this evidently takes significant time to complete. So for reference, the Center for Women's Welfare conducts a city comparison, and we'll actually talk about that more later in the presentation. And right now that takes about 3 to 5 hours to conduct. And then lastly, another important thing to note is that these certain type analyses, such as the city comparison, are only conducted and changed by experienced researchers. So there's essentially a bottleneck in how many people can utilize the data and the standard itself.
So this leads us to our research question. How can we store self-sufficiency standard data to increase the efficiency for stakeholders to use the data and extract meaningful information and conduct novel analyses? So for this, we perform database development process, which actually consists of 4 main parts, including the preparation step. So initially, we conducted stakeholder meetings and further research to be able to understand the columns and their relationships better. So in order to store the data from all the files in one database, we preprocessed the files to standardize the column names. Then we created the relational model schema that arranges the data in a series of tables, rows, and columns with a relationship between tables. And then we use the Python to read the data from the Excel files and do cleaning and pre-processing. So we use SQL Alchemy to create database tables and insert the data from the files into a SQLite database. So this is actually our final result for the database schema. So in the self-sufficiency standard data, most of the columns are consistent among files, but there are a few columns that contain extra information and they're only present in some files. So in order to increase the efficiency of accessing the data, we created one table with the data that is always present and 3 helper tables, which are GeoIdentifier, CT, and Puma, to contain extra information that is only sometimes available. We also added Boolean columns to the main table, which are healthcare, miscellaneous, and ARPA, to the main table to indicate when the extra information was available. And the report data, as you can see here, it's a data that comes from census. So as we all know, we need the primary keys. So our main primary keys were family type, state, place, and analysis type that it was same across the main and helper tables to make it easy to link the data across tables.
So as we have like the supplement information that is not come from the original goal of this project, but during our discussion with our stakeholders, we kind of inspired by their ideas. We saw the possibilities that researchers can conduct other or supplement research and measurement based on this open data sources. So for healthcare, miscellaneous, and ARPA, as Aziza mentioned before, this data originally come from the self-sufficiency data set. And the Puma city county, the city table, and the GeoIdentifier is come from the census HUD or CPI data set. Mostly for the Puma, for example, the Puma is the full name, Puma is the short name of the public use microdata areas. And we link to the ACS data set, which is American Community Survey, a part of the one kind of the census data. And this data, this combination make it possible for us to compare, for example, the percentage, the population percentage above and below the self-sufficiency standards across some kind of like areas. And the city county, the city table, we refer to the city county crosswalk table since most of the standards are county based. And if we want to compare the city, let's say Seattle and San Francisco, we need to go back to see which county the city belongs to. So this crosswalk table make it more efficient to compare the cities about the self-sufficiency standards. The GeoIdentifier is easier for us and the researchers to compare the CPI and the inflation justice across by years when the CPI changes, and the report date is mostly for the log purpose when the database updated.
So one of the key goals and ethical considerations of this project was providing transparent processes for our project leads and our community partners with varying technical backgrounds. And this was to ensure that the workflow and analyses are reproducible beyond the scope of this 10-week project period. So to do so, we provided rigorous documentation of our code in the form of markdown files on our GitHub repository. And this was split up into two parts. So the first was how to set up your technical environment. And so this includes downloading the specific software and initializing the database. And the second part was how to insert and retrieve data. And so specifically how to pass files into the database.
And based on the documentation and improved workflow, those responsible for conducting analyses will be able to produce analyses which are now more reproducible because a lot of the operations are more automatic and less manual driven. And I'll give an example of how the workflow has changed before and after the database. And in addition, with the database, we, the fellows, were able to conduct analyses that were not possible prior to the creation of the database. So for the workflow example, we're specifically looking at analyses across cities, and we're interested in comparing similar sized US cities across time. And before the database, this was only done at one point in time, and it was across only one type of family type. As you can see in this map, there were only family types listed for one adult and one preschoolers, and the self-sufficiency wages needed for that specific family type. And this was the workflow to create the map just shown. The person responsible for creating this analysis would have to open 16 files, which was for 4 cities across 4 different years because of how the data is stored. And from there, click on filter settings to get the specific family type and copy and paste the rows of interest into a new file to create visualizations of interest. And overall, this workflow took about 3 to 5 hours to complete. However, now with the database, this process is a lot more shorter. And specifically, we would just call the database and retrieve the information and the information of interest and run our code. And this would take 5 minutes. And another thing to note now with the database, and as I mentioned earlier, this work is more reproducible and applicable in other settings because you can just change a couple lines of code to retrieve the same type of information, but let's say for different states. Okay, so what we have here now with the database, we are able to compare several cities across different years and include many different family types. And prior to the database, this was not possible. We were only able to look at one specific year and one specific family type across several cities. And now, because of our detailed documentation and improved workflow, we are now able to reproduce these analyses in different settings. And one analysis of interest that we conducted was comparing graduate student salaries to the Self-Sufficiency Standard. And specifically, we were interested in looking at single adult PhD student wages to the Self-Sufficiency Standard across 2 different universities across 2 different years. And as you can see, it's not enough. So what we have on the left here, What we have on the left here is the self-sufficiency wages for King County, Seattle for a single adult. And then we have in the gold UW's PhD student wages. And on the right, we have the self-sufficiency wages for the Los Angeles County for one adult in purple. And then we have UCLA PhD student wages in the light blue across 2 different years.
So we also conducted additional analysis in terms of gender wage gap. So since the earnings gap between men and women varies by state, how is the gender wage gap impacted by the difference in the cost of living as defined by the Self-Sufficiency Standard data? So we conducted analysis for 3 household types where there is one adult, as you can see here, one adult and 1 preschooler, and another one is 1 adult, 1 preschooler, and 1 school age. As an engineers, we were interested in analyzing the cities that are hubs for technology. Thus, we chose King County, Seattle, and San Francisco County, which encompasses itself only San Francisco City. From the analysis, we found that both female and male adults living alone can afford themselves in both cities. However, when a child is involved, single mothers cannot afford 1 preschooler in both cities. So while single father can actually afford 1 preschooler plus 1 school age in both cities, so this actually clearly shows that there is a greater impact of gender wage gap in cost of living.
So we also, according to this database, we are able to create a live interactive website, a map, which if you click, it will compare some kind of stuffs. And this is the first ever we could compare the self-sufficiency standards and the poverty line nationally. And if they are empty of the polygon, which means we did not collect the data of the state, which is empty. And the area with deeper purple, and which indicate the higher percentage of the population below the self-sufficiency standards. And when we click 1 polygon of the state, it will pop up the information of the percentage of population under the self-sufficiency standards and the percentage of the population below the poverty line on the top right. As take Washington state as example, like around 20% of the population below the self-sufficiency standards, but only around 6% of the population below the poverty line. This is also echo of the claim we have before. There's a big gap between the self-sufficiency standards and the poverty line. And moreover, if we zoom into 1 state, let's see, we just picked the Puma area, which is the University of Washington located. And the percentage of self-sufficiency standards and poverty line will, for this specific Puma, will pop up on the top right. Yeah, since it's kind of mirror here. Take an example for this area, if like 2 adults and 1 infant, maybe like a graduate student's family, and the self-sufficiency standards is around 78,000 for enough because self-sufficient, but the poverty line only claim 22K, which is much lower than the self-sufficiency standards.
And so because this is an ongoing contribution to a long-term project, we wanted to envision how the database will live on in a visual and accessible format. So this is a dashboard designed for a general audience to explore the standard in a more digestible format. So what's made easier here is that you can clearly see the database structure, the table you're accessing, and then you can explore the standard for specific states, counties, years, and family types. And then after that, you can easily drag the values to what you would want to visualize in a plot. And while this is just a concept design, it can be handed off to the Center for Women's Welfare to build as the database gets further developed. And that is the end of our presentation. Thank you to our sponsors. And if you would like to interact with the national comparisons map that Chang shared, we have a tiny URL at the bottom.